Well, in your paper you argue that international relations scholars haven't to date played a role in framing theory about internet governance. What would, in your opinion, the key characteristics of a post-international theory be?
I'm not sure how much time I have to answer that question, but basically what the founders of the so-called theory are really working towards is to expand a definition of authority. So thinking beyond the sovereign state, of course, in the modern international system. And then thinking about how these different spheres of authority overlap with the state. So they're not going as far as a hyper-globalist to say that the state is dead. But in areas such as internet governance, that we really do need to consider the wide range of actors that are converging on this sort of post-international or post-sovereign world that takes conventional views of jurisdiction and where boundaries, political boundaries or borders may lie, and especially in international relations theory where the foreign and domestic meet. There's sort of two schools in IR, those who are focused mainly on the international or exclusively, and others that are interested in the relationship with domestic politics. And I think we see in internet governance that domestic politics, despite the global functions and characteristics of the internet, matter more and more in today's world.
And where does sort of transnational theory come into all of this?
Transnational theory, which authors specifically are you thinking about?
In terms of IR theory that deals with transnational politics and sort of transnational governance.
I suppose there's some natural overlap. I think post-internationalism as a theory is definitely a work in progress. So the early transnationalists in the 1970s, like Robert Cohen, Joseph Nye, on this side of the Atlantic, Susan Strange, and others, they basically got the ball rolling to think about beyond the state, those actors. So I think the roots of post-internationalism very much in the British tradition, English school tradition of international political economy. And so working from that base into kind of the present 21st century mode of politics.
And how do these debates contribute to the internet governance debate? How do you see them contributing?
That's the trickiest question of all, is to work from the existing literature, maybe update it a bit and redefine some of the terms. As I talked about in the paper, the term internet governance is one of the thorniest of all because traditionally within the cross-disciplinary literature has been defined for the most part as ICANN, in sort of the body politic that works around ICANN. And in my paper, I align with those who say, wait a minute, it's much more than ICANN. We really do have to think, again, these multiple spheres of authority overlapping and the range of issues, everything from cybercrime to e-commerce to the governance of infrastructure, of the internet. There are so many areas where the state, NGOs, individuals, what Professor Derderian talked about today, the infosphere of this kind of philosophical divide of the war machine and the terrorist. This is the kind of challenge, is to sort this all out and figure out where power, the theme of the conference, really comes into conflict with these various actors and what the big struggle is all about in the end.
And why is post-international theory, in your view, the best way to capture this dynamic in these relationships?
I think it was really out of my frustration as a graduate student is looking at the existing base of theories, so liberalism, realism, constructivism, critical theory, the 4 or 5 major branches, and just not being able to do enough with those, and thinking that we might need to think in a new direction or do what Nye and Cohen and Strange did and synthesize some of these other grand theories. So it's sort of just offering something on the table. I have great admiration for Professor Rosenau and Professor Mansbach and Ferguson, kind of the founders of this new theoretical school, because they're pushing in the right direction. They're asking questions about technology. They're asking questions about these multiple actors and the political environment that's changing. So I think they're pushing things in the right direction. And whether post-internationalism has a chance to develop in a full-blown theory, have to have a conversation 10 years from now to see if it really amounts to something. But trying to do what this conference is doing and stimulate the conference in a new direction, working from the existing literature.
Could you give me a concrete, real-world example of how this theory plays out?
Well, theory and the real world sometimes don't meet in a happy place, but I suppose in the area of my own research, looking at convergence, and convergence is really about the internet taking over everything that we knew is telecom and broadcast that fits into this infosphere of digitization. And I think when you look at that, you look at where the Westphalian system of governing telecom networks started with the state, and you think about just 20 years ago when liberalization started, the entire base of governance shifted away from states owning and operating telecom companies, a monopoly in almost every case, to this sort of freewheeling, more capitalist type internet. And now we're left with this stew of very difficult questions to answer of who is governing the internet. And so trying to apply post-internationalism, and again, in my own research, I'm interested where the foreign and domestic meet. So how things are regulated, who's regulating it? Do we really have global governance in international institutions? Or do we have a mix with national authorities that may be picking up some of the pieces that were left to international organizations in the telecom era and the kind of tussle between the foreign domestic realms again. So post-international theory is saying, look, where do these realms intersect? What authorities are involved? Does the state have the ultimate say, or do we really need to theorize and come up with a new model for the power structure that's playing out today?
In your conclusion, you call for a dialogue between UK and US scholars in terms of international political economy. What theoretically do you think this would achieve, and do you think it would have any real-world sort of impact in the long term?
That's another good question. I think you've hit on an opportunity, at least, myself as an American coming to the UK, to really pick up a different base of literature than what I had studied as an undergraduate and so forth in the US, and trying to find the common ground. And we come from a common culture, and there is precedent in the past with, again, the Susan Stranges of the world, the Hedley Bulls, who was here, and a lot of these people aren't British, who actually founded pioneers in the English School of International Relations. So structuring some type of dialogue. There's an interesting professor, just a paper last month by Professor Cohen, who talked about the opportunity to bridge the gap between the, this is one of the most important areas because IPE started almost near simultaneously in the 1970s on both sides of the Atlantic, but there is a divergence in approach and methodology and theory. And so in this age of communications, there's no reason why we can't bring these schools closer together and take on these enormous, huge tasks.
Some would argue that Europe and America differ more widely than Britain and than the UK and America in terms of theory and in terms of methodology. And if you have the EU emerging as a new player in the internet governance game, then wouldn't it be more important to then focus on bridging the gap between continental European philosophy or political philosophy and Anglo-Saxon, as it were,
sure.
Political philosophy?
No, absolutely. I mean, the Francophones and other kind of great basis of international relations scholarship, I think, and look at multi-level governance in the EU. Brussels is where it's happening. If there is supranationalism and new types of governance that are emerging that call for new theory, it will very likely happen in Europe because we have a tough time fitting the EU into existing IR theory because it is different. It's not just a supranational actor, it's something quite unprecedented. So, and I suppose in the philosophy that drives the EU from Schuman to Monet and others, that we really should study that closely and maybe take the Anglo side and point it towards Brussels to find a better solution.
In terms of real-world policy and politics again, where do you think the real internet governance debate will be played out in the next few years?
Well, we thought it was going to play out in Geneva and Tunisia with the World Summit on Information Society, and certainly a very important part of the dialogue. But again, I think from the different diplomats and official state representatives and NGO people I talked to, I think there's great disappointment that the political ball of yarn got caught up in ICANN again, and there was a missed opportunity to really do something much larger. So whether this new Internet Governance Forum that the UN is backing out of the WSIS has any legitimacy or credibility to push the dialogue forward with a different agenda, I'm not sure. But I have a feeling, and it will be interesting to see how the conference wraps up today, that again, there may not be just one venue like the WSIS ever again that drives it. I mean, states may try, and the WSIS, after all, is hosted by the ITU, the UN, and state organizations. And there's a great hope on their part, I think, that they will have a louder, stronger voice in internet governance. But I'm very skeptical of that. But I think in terms of where researchers should focus, there's not enough emphasis or analysis of states at the national level and what they're doing within their own respective countries. And that calls for a comparative analysis, kind of the conventional tools of the trade to look at those things. So it's kind of ironic. I mean, you're a post-internationalist coming back to the state again. But the domestic politics that kind of slips under the radar screen of global governance, that's the challenge, is to figure out, again, where the foreign domestic meet, and if any alternative venues pop up that we need to be paying attention to.
Would the post-internationalists see winners and losers in this, and who would they be?
Oh, sure. Trying to put my post-international aside and think about bias, that I suppose the U.S. could end up being a loser in the long run because it has less authority probably to shape the internet than it did before. It's interesting that the U.S. was always proud of its infrastructure relationship, developing the kind of progenitor of the internet, inventing it, pushing it in a direction. So it's really a U.S. internet up until fairly recently. But U.S. power to shape the future of the internet is probably in decline and may never reach that zenith again. So China, I mean, again, coming back to states, but so call them economies. I think where the economies of the internet develop the fastest or the greatest will be probably the venues of the future. So East Asia will likely play a huge role. India, with its rising information society middle class, that there's probably great hope and maybe benefits if the U.S. does not have as much of an imprint on the internet. And the challenge, I think, for other states and actors is to produce these venues that try to forge this multi-stakeholder debate that everyone is, for the most part, hoping for. Maybe not hegemonic powers, but that the rising economies that will be shaping the internet of the future, that they try to hopefully push it in a more democratic position so that they're not just wanting to create state-sponsored venues to work through the problem solutions. I think that's common ground, hopefully, that all countries can meet upon. And that was the spirit of the WSIS, is to try to get away from states, but always have to be cautious that states are not ultimately setting the agenda and trying to pull things back into a framework where they control kind of all the chips and have the power.
So finally, is the nation state dead?
No, absolutely not. Post-internationalists, I think, always get accused of saying that the state is dead and kind of falling into the trap of the hyper-globalists. But by no means is the state dead. But you have to keep a close eye on what the state's motivations are and perhaps venues that it tries to capture. In my research, I look a lot at independent regulators, which are really an outgrowth of the Reagan-Thatcher liberalization period that is now, for the most part, the de facto economic regime in the world. And the state, of course, has created these things now that were focused on kind of old technologies, old businesses. But they're retooling those. And in this country and others, that they're focused very much on the internet as part of governance. So the state is not dead, and it will likely play a pretty important role. But where the state meets with these other stakeholders and which venues, and your question was spot on of who emerges as the dominant player in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shefali.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much.